Hello and welcome to this lecture for Introduction to Philosophy. And today we're going to look at an essay by Martha Nussbaum called The Vulnerability of the Good Human Life. And this essay was originally chapter 11 in Nussbaum's 1986 book called The Fragility of Goodness, Look at Ethics in Greek Tragedy and Philosophy. And the book as a whole in this chapter, we'll get a taste of the argument as a whole. And it's really an argument about the place of tragedy in human life. The Greek appreciation for tragedy here is, in Aristotle at least, as we'll see in Nussbaum's argument, is about Aristotle's argument about tragedy. We'll see that Aristotle has a very sort of deep and complex understanding of the vulnerability of human life, the fact of our exposure to danger and risk. And it's that point that drives this deeper understanding of the place of tragedy in our lives. So I think this gives us a very interesting perspective on Aristotle. I think this gives us a very good perspective and an interesting perspective on Aristotle's theory, and it also gives us a deeper understanding of tragedy, and a good understanding of how tragedy responds to these basic facts about human existence, in particular this sort of vulnerability and exposure to risk, and how that affects and changes the way our appreciation of tragedy itself and what it can do. Okay, so in this chapter, Nussbaum focuses on Aristotle's account of the nature of human vulnerability. So the issue here is that our efforts to live the good life can go wrong through no fault of our own. And we've seen that's sort of the essence of the way a tragedy works, with the idea of unmerited misfortune. We have pity for the tragic protagonist because they're in a situation where their misfortune is unmerited. So we can sympathize with them, put ourselves in their position. And so that sort of fact about tragedy, Aristotle's argument is that that's actually a feature of human life itself, that our efforts to live the good life will go wrong through no fault of our own. So this is something that is common to human experience, and Aristotle's going to reflect on the nature of that insight and what it reveals to us about human experience and how it changes how we think about the good life and the things that we pursue and the things that have value and meaning in our lives. Okay, so let's walk through the arguments in this chapter, in Nussbaum's chapter, The Vulnerability of the Good Human Life. And let's see if we can sort of break down and make sense of the argument. And the starting point is this sort of laying out of two extreme positions. So the two kind of extreme positions that we can take on this issue. The first one says that living well is just the same thing as having a fortunate life. In other words, it's all about luck. So if you're happy, satisfied, wealthy, etc., you attribute all that to luck. I was lucky. Another person who's poor and not doing well, not as fortunate, that person is just unlucky, right? So everything good that happens to us is the result of luck. When nothing good happens to us, that's the result of having bad luck. Okay, so that's one extreme. It's all about luck. On the other side of things, the argument is everything relevant to living well is entirely within the power of the person themselves. So luck is irrelevant to living well. Right? Everything is in our power. Nothing is down to luck and chance and fortune. Right? Everything is within the power of the person themselves. Right? So these are the two extremes. An important thing to note is that Aristotle's purpose in setting out these extremes, he's not just going to chart a middle course, as in he's not just going to say, well, these positions are extremes, let's find a middle ground. What he really wants to do is find what's true in both of these positions, and he thinks that there is something fundamentally true in both of them. We just have to sort of dig that out. if we sort of dig out the truth, we'll be led to a better position that sort of synthesizes these two. It's not just a sort of middle course, but it's a position that takes account of the insights in both of these extreme positions. Okay, so let's take the first claim, which is that it's all about luck. Now, in his response to this view, Aristotle argues that this belief is too much at odds with our deep-seated evaluative beliefs about what makes a life worth living. Very simply, we think that the good life requires freely chosen activity in pursuit of our goals, right? So our sense of satisfaction, our sense that life has been well lived, depends on this sense that we've achieved things by pursuing things, by undertaking activity in pursuit of our goals, right? So it makes a difference if you achieve one of your life plans, if you achieve something that for you is meaningful and fundamental, right? It matters that you've actually done things in pursuit of the goal, right? So to suddenly have things sort of thrust into your lap, to suddenly have things given to you so that you have things by luck, that's something that's not as it doesn't satisfy us in the same way. It feels contingent. It's not intrinsically related to our commitment and our activity and our commitment in pursuit of our goals, right? So that aspect makes a difference, and we sort of recognize that when we recognize that when somebody sort of achieves something, whether they're an Olympic athlete, whether they have achieved excellence in some particular area, whether it's music, art, or whatever, that we recognize that the work that they put in to reach that kind of achievement, that matters a great deal. All of the hours of training, all of the hours of preparation or learning, right? Those are the things which allow us to achieve excellence. And our view of the good life sort of recognizes that's what matters, that we act in pursuit of our goals. So the point here is that to say it's all about luck, conflicts with something fundamental for us as humans, that we believe that chosen activity in pursuit of our goals matters a great deal. So this is part of Aristotle's definition of eudaimonia, which is usually translated as happiness, although a better way of capturing it is, I think, living well rather than happiness. And a reason for that is because eudaimonia is supervenient on activity accomplished in pursuit of our goals. That means that we only get this sense of eudaimonia, this sort of sense of satisfaction of living well. We only get that as a result of doing other things, right? So it's a result of accomplishing something that the feeling of eudaimonia will accompany that feeling of accomplishment, right? So it depends on some other successful kind of activity. It depends on us achieving success in some other activity, and eudaimonia is kind of the result. It's a sort of something that emerges, a state that emerges as a result of our accomplishing things in pursuit of our goals. So within that way of understanding things, the virtues are the character traits that allow us to be successful in pursuing our goals. And we saw Plato has a sort of similar conception of virtue. So virtues are the kind of traits, whether it's sort of courage, if in a kind of military sense, courage is a character trait that allows us to face danger, so it can be one that is vital to success in any kind of military endeavor, right? So the virtues are related to specific kinds of pursuit and specific kinds of success, and they enable us to achieve success in pursuit of those goals. So after looking at the it's all about luck view, what we can say is that what's worth keeping from that idea is that the good life is vulnerable and can be disrupted by catastrophe, right? So yes, luck is important. Luck plays a role. whether we're happy or unhappy, whether we have eudaimonia or not, that itself can depend on luck, right? So the good life is vulnerable. It can be disrupted depending on whether we have luck, whether chance goes our way or it doesn't. And that's what we're recognizing in the it's all about luck view. That's the sort of hidden truth of that view. Okay, so let's take up the second perspective here, which is the opposite perspective, that luck is irrelevant to living well. So while living well, eudaimonia, as we saw, requires activity and exertion for its completion, it is vulnerable to various forms of luck, right? So Aristotle's going to respond to this by saying that there is a gap between being good and living well. Okay, and that gap between being good and living well is what makes luck relevant to whether we are living well or not, right? So we want to maintain this idea of activity. Yes, human activity, in Greek that's energeia, is very fundamental, very important for living well. We have to exert ourselves in different kinds of worthwhile human activity. And the fact that it depends on us acting is what makes us exposed to luck, right? So if you just hold, as a lot of these sort of opponents of luck do, that you can be very happy just having a good state, just sort of feeling good about yourself, right? Aristotle doesn't believe that. He thinks that being sort of this state of eudaimonia, living well, requires us to do things, requires us to expose ourselves through activity in pursuit of our goal, and that opens up a gap where luck can interfere with our sort of plans, our intentions, and can open up a gap between being good and living well. So an example that illustrates this particular argument, Aristotle asks us to imagine a person who sleeps for their entire life. So can we imagine that such a person is living well, right? And again, the people that just want to reduce living well to a kind of good condition might say, well, possibly this person might be happy, they might be having happy dreams, right? Is that enough for living well? And Aristotle's answer, as we saw, is going to be that no, that's not sufficient, right? We can't imagine a person who never does anything leading a good human life. Whatever potential a person has, so here we've got to say that the dreamer has potential but doesn't realize that potential, right? Whatever potential a person has, they find their flourishing, their actualization in self-chosen activity, in actually doing things to pursue their goal, right? So that's fundamental to human well-being. Okay, so here's a quote from Aristotle's Eudaimian Ethics, one of the two major works on ethics that he published. So he says, no activity, energeia, is complete if it is impeded or blocked. But eudaimonia is something complete. So the eudaimon person needs the goods of the body and external goods and goods of luck, in addition, so that his activities should not be impeded. Those who claim that the person who is being tortured on the wheel, or the person who has encountered great reversals of fortune, is eudaimon, so long as he is good, are not saying anything, whether that is their intention or not. Right? So Aristotle's quite sort of forceful on this question, that it's meaningless to talk about a person being eudaimon whose fortune is reversed, as we've seen in tragedies, a person who's being tortured. So the kind of the attempt to reduce goodness to something that's just inside as opposed to outside, those attempts for Aristotle can't be maintained, right? That if eventually the person is going to lose something by not having the capacity to express themselves, to actualize their potential in action, right? So eventually the tortured person you know, apart from the sort of pain they're feeling, is going to have missed opportunities to sort of actualize their personhood. The person who is sleeping or is in a coma is again going to have missed opportunities to be active, to actualize their potential, and to participate in various sort of worthy kinds of activity, right? So we need these things to happen, and because we need activity and external goods in addition, right, our action is exposed to chance, and that means it's exposed to the potential of tragedy. Okay, so Aristotle gives us a number of categories to help us see how luck and chance interfere with activity in pursuit of eudaimonia. And there's two categories, each with two distinct sort of sections or claims in them. Okay, so the first one is that excellent activity is deprived of some resource, right? And that resource might be health, wealth, or friends. And that resource can be absolutely necessary for excellent activity, right? So maybe that deprived of health, activity is absolutely impossible, or its absence may constrain or impede the performance of the activity, right? So without sufficient health, we may be unable to complete our wishes of sort of joining up with the Olympic team. We may be unable to train. That may hinder our performance, right? So this idea, so a resource, whether it's health, we may have insufficient wealth for pursuing a particular activity if it needs some kind of monetary resources, and friendship. You know, friendship becomes impossible, as Aristotle points out, if a friend dies, if we move away, if we're isolated. So we can understand all these things as resources in that sense. The other category is circumstances can block the very object or recipient of the activity, right? So death of a friend in this case can sort of, here it's not just a resource that we can use in activity, but it's actually kind of blocking the activity itself. So the activity might be completely blocked, so you know, friendship could be blocked, or the activity could be impeded if the loss is temporary or partial. So of course we can get other friends, you know, over time that can sort of make up for this loss, right? So here it's the circumstances that block the very object or recipient of the activity, right? So it's the object or recipient of the activity itself that is the issue, not the sort of resource that is used in the activity. Okay, so here's what Aristotle says on resources. Again, this is from the Eudaimian Ethics. Eudaimonia evidently needs the external goods as well, as we said. For many things are done through friendship and wealth and political capability as through tools, right? So all of those things, friendship, wealth, capability, can be seen as tools for getting on in the practices that involve living well, right? So deprivation of some things defiles blessedness. For example, good birth, good children, good looks. For nobody will entirely live well if he is entirely disgusting to look at, or base-born, or both solitary and childless. Still less perhaps if he has terribly bad children or friends, or has good ones who die. Okay, so this is all about the sort of, you know, the external goods and our dependence on them, their use as resources, and the fact that we're dependent on them as resources if we're going to lead the good life that we're seeking for, right? There's some very kind of pragmatic acknowledgement here that our well-being can depend on features we don't control, what we look like, how we're, you know, the circumstances we're born into, whether we live alone, whether we're childless, if our children are bad and misbehaved, and maybe to some extent at least it's not our fault. Right, so all of those things can affect our happiness, can affect our well-being, can sort of, make it impossible, put strong barriers against the possibility of us achieving the good life and living well. So all of these things count as things that can be sort of barriers or impediments that can impede our pursuit of the good life. Okay, so Nussbaum points out this really important fact that she says an Aristotelian conception of eudaimonia, which bases excellent activity on stable goodness of character, makes the good life tolerably stable in the face of the world. But this stability is not limitless. There is a real gap between being good and living well. Uncontrolled happening can step into this gap, impeding the good state of character from finding its proper fulfillment in action. Right? So this gap between being good and living well, again, that's what happens when the resources go missing that we need to live well, right? Whether it's health, we can get sick and be unable to pursue our goals, wealth, or other things, other capabilities that we might need go missing, other resources like friends and colleagues that we need go missing, right? So these things can create a gap between our good intentions and our sort of good state, as opposed to actually realizing that and living well, right? So that gap is the condition of tragedy, right? The gap between our intentions and our sort of goodness of character, and the fact that despite of that, we can go wrong when we try to actualize our goals and put them into effect through lack of resources or through the circumstances not being of our making in which we try to actualize our goals. Now, Oedipus is an example of the latter kind of gap, where it's a gap between our awareness and the circumstances in which we act. So it's the circumstances that don't allow us to put our goals into practice and to realize them as we would wish. And the gap in Oedipus is between the act he intended or voluntarily did. Right at the crossroads, he kills an old man. In the car, in the film, he shoots him. He's in the back of the car. In the play, he kills the old man at the crossroads. And then there's the bad act that he involuntarily did. It's the same act, right? But it's the act of killing his father. That wasn't his intended act. His intended act was to kill the old man at the crossroads. He didn't know it was his father. So the act of parricide, of father killing, was involuntary, right? So it's the fact that the circumstances created this gap between what he did voluntarily and what he did involuntarily that dislodged Oedipus from his eudaimonia, right? That gap meant he could never recover his eudaimonia after the act of father killing, right? I know that to go along with this, you've got to accept that killing an old man is not that bad. We can't, I guess we could speak about Greek cultural remorse here, but certainly when in the play itself, there doesn't seem to be all that much concern about the killing of an old man as opposed to killing his father. And I guess we have to sort of register that difference when we talk about the play. But yeah, certainly there's that difference in intention. He intends to kill an old man. He doesn't intend to kill his father. So the circumstances impeded and thwarted Oedipus's blameless and appropriate activation of his character, stepping into the gap between the intention and the act, right? And it's that gap between intention and the act that lies at the basis of tragedy and makes a difference in terms of how we're unable to put our intentions into practice in a way that leads us to fulfill the good life. All right, so doing our best to live an excellent life, to put our goals into practice, is what exposes us to vulnerability and thereby to tragedy. And Nussbaum, I think, is very good on this question, that it's the very fact that we're trying to live an excellent life, that we're trying to do well in practices that sustain human excellence. That's what exposes us to tragedy. Certain excellences like courage, political commitment, love of friends, lead us into situations that make us vulnerable, right? That's, clearly the case with courage, right? It's a sort of valued excellence. We highly value people who have this virtue, who exercise it. But of course, that commitment is going to lead those people into situations of danger, and that's why we value, in a particular way, we value people like firefighters, and people who sort of face danger with courage, right? But their very commitment to that excellence is what leads them into situations in which they're vulnerable, in which they're exposed to danger, right? So Nussbaum's saying that all excellence is like that. We're exposed not always to physical danger like firefighters, but we're certainly exposed to losing the values that we hold dear because we want to pursue and actualize them. So in seeking to live well, we expose ourselves to various ways in which we can fail and go wrong. And we cannot avoid these risks as long as we seek to live our best lives, right? So we could avoid these risks if we stopped doing things, if we stopped caring about excellence and we stopped trying to live our best lives. But, then we're only cheating ourselves, right? We're not doing the things that are going to enable us to live excellence. To live excellently. We can avoid pain that way, but of course, in avoiding pain, what we're doing is we're also avoiding the possibility of actualizing ourselves and living a life that reflects that commitment. Okay, so let's draw together a few conclusions from what we've learnt about Aristotle from Nussbaum in this lecture. So Nussbaum shows that Aristotle's view of tragedy is rooted in his deep sense of human vulnerability, the dependence of the good life on circumstances and resources that are beyond the control of the agent. Right? So it's in that sense that when we act, we become exposed, right? Either through circumstances that are not as we believe them to be, or through resources that we lack or we lose, and which are beyond our own control. Secondly, the gap between being good and living well means that uncontrolled happenings can step into that gap, right? And that's the place where tragedy happens. And when that happens, it prevents the good state of character from leading to fulfillment in activity, right? So between what we want to do and what actually happens, there's a gap that opens up, that uncontrolled things, loss of resources, unforeseen circumstances step into the gap and sort of block the transition from the state of character to actualization in good activities. The gap between Oedipus's intention and the real circumstances, as we saw, thwarted Oedipus and dislodged him from eudaimonia, right? So it's his ignorance of the circumstances in which he acts and the consequences of that ignorance that lead him to killing his father and then marrying his mother. Those are the things that sort of dislodge him from eudaimonia, right? So again, Oedipus is a story about human vulnerability, of how his dependence on those circumstances made him vulnerable, and the things that sort of happened in that gap between his sort of conception and his action, right, led to a tragic outcome for Oedipus. So I think this gives us some really interesting resources for thinking about tragedy more broadly as a sort of tragedy as sort of part of human life, and allow us to see how it also provides a reading of tragic plays as picking up on that sort of ordinary tragedy of human life.